So, James, tell me something about your parentage, your mother's family, your father's family, and any influences they had on you.
Well, my father was a senior civil servant in London, but born and brought up in Northern Ireland until the First World War, when at the age, how old would he have been in 1914? He'd have been about 18 or 19. He was called up and served in well, he wouldn't have been called up because there were volunteers in those days, but he went as a volunteer and fought throughout the war in the artillery in northern France. Then when he came back, he became a civil servant in London, didn't return to Northern Ireland except on holiday. And my mother, also from Northern Ireland, came of a very large family, which was, well, really both families were rather academic. My father's father was a professor of philosophy and theology in Magee College in Derry, in the north of Ireland. And my mother's family, my mother's parents, were both doctors. And actually my mother's mother was one of the very first women doctors anywhere. And both of them went and spent their lives in India, where they were missionary doctors in India. That was where my mother was born and lived until she was 8, when she was sent back to the north of Ireland and was brought up by relatives in the north of Ireland. Yes, well, my mother's uncles, my father's brothers. One of them was a fellow of Christ's here in Cambridge, and another of them was an eccentric but very brilliant physicist at the National Physical Laboratory. So there was a kind of academic background on both my mother's and my father's side. But in both cases, it was really, my mother's parents' generation were the first generation of academics, and before that, both families had been were really small-scale tenant farmers in the north of Ireland.
Do you feel in any way Irish, or?
Well, I've always felt that I have a double identity. That I feel in. Although I spent all of my life in England, I always went as a child and spent a month in Ireland. And for me, it was a kind of wondrous homeland, a place that we always so looked forward to going and staying with our grandparents. And we just found it wonderful. And I think of it as a really essential component of my identity. And I feel really rather strongly that we should be constantly celebrating shared identities, mixed identities, instead of all the appalling nationalism we're forced into by things like football and the Olympic Games and so on, which I think are terribly destructive, where people really are encouraged to have one national identity, instead of celebrating shared identities, which so many of us have, and which I think should be positively valued. Certainly I value mine.
Thank you very much. Did either of your parents particularly influence you? I mean, either your mother or your father, either emotionally or intellectually? Were you very close to either of them?
I think they both influenced me, but in quite different ways. My father died when I was 18. He died of cancer of the lung, and his last 3 or 4 years were really very, very hard for us all. So my teenage years were very much affected by my father's illness and his eventual death. He actually died during the time when I was taking my A-levels at the age of 18. So it was a very difficult time then. But he was kind of quiet and strong and a kind of figure that I felt very close to, but somebody who one would respect rather than be close to. And no, I had a very great admiration for my father. My mother was different. My mother was kind of wild and emotional and enthusiastic, and came from a family that had all the time where there was passionate discussion and arguing and was anything but restrained. And so there was a total contrast between the restraint of my father and the tremendous enthusiasms of my mother, who was a tremendously kind of warm and loving person, full of enthusiasm and vigor, and really restrained is the very last word that one would apply to her. And she came of a family who shared these characteristics. Lots of strong opinions and arguments and discussions about people, which were often libelous and over the top. And it was a kind of really, I thought, a good atmosphere to be brought up in. All this enthusiasm and kind of often over the top talk.
Where did you go to school? Your first and second schools?
Well, my schooling was much affected both by my father's illness, but also by the war, because when the war broke out, I was 5 years old in 1939.
So you were born in 1934?
I was born in 1934, and so my earliest memories are just before the war started. And then the war came, and that very much affected my education, because for a time we were sent to stay with relatives up in Scotland and in Ireland at the peak of the bombing, because we were living 12 miles south of the centre of London in Purley, which is just near to Croydon, just south of London, which was one of the areas that was most affected by the bombing. Every house in the area where I live was damaged by bombing, and I think around 1 in 10 were destroyed. It was very severely affected, partly because it was on the way home for the bombers coming in from Germany, and those that hadn't dropped their bombs on their targets in London got rid of them as they were going south out of the city, and a number of those fell close to us. But at the time of the war and of my early education, it wasn't for me at all a time of trauma. It was a time of excitement. I don't look back to the war as a time of horror or difficulty. It was a time of tremendous excitement, and all of the local children spent all of their time rushing around trying to find pieces of shrapnel, pieces of bomb, and the great prize was to try and find anything with German writing on it. And the local police had a terrible time keeping the squads of small boys away from sites of newly bombed areas. I mean, we were completely, or certainly I was completely uninterested in the carnage and the destruction. What we wanted were relics of the war, and by the end of the war, our garage was completely full of these relics.
Does that explain your famous current garages or sheds filled with, which I've heard legendary stories of, filled with jam jars, filled with other things?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we certainly were. Certainly, our family were always accumulators. Yes. Anyway, so that affected my education, and I mean, I went to a succession of often for rather brief periods of local schools, and then, as I've said, for a while I was away in Scotland or Ireland at other schools. I had a brief experience of what I thought was absolutely appalling Scottish education in Greenock, where my uncle lived, where it was a supposedly co-educational school, but the girls were on one side of the classroom and the boys on the other. There was corporal punishment in front of the class for boys, but not for girls, and the girls spent their entire time trying to harass the boys so that they would be beaten in front of the class. And if there was ever a system for encouraging gender hatred, it struck me that that was it. But that was a fairly brief interlude. I mean, I was completely horrified by that, I may say. It really co-educational, but co-educational, creating conflicts between men and women, or between boys and girls. Anyway, at the age of 11, I sat for a range of entrance exams to a series of different schools, and got admission to, got scholarships to more than one school, but eventually went to a local minor public school called Whitgift, which had the advantage of some really very able masters, but also some very incompetent ones. I mean, it was much affected by the war, and the big problem was, that recruitment, obviously, for schools at that time was extremely difficult. So it wasn't an easy time, the education. I mean, and we were, as children, I came of a family we were 3 brothers and a sister, but an awful lot of our time was out of school, was spent rushing around the countryside. We had a radius of about 20 miles from our house that we cycled to, and were constantly out. We had a great concern with natural history. We collected pond life in particular, the 3 kinds of newt. We knew a great deal about water beetles and other pond creatures. And we would cycle all over the area to find rare varieties. It was a time of great excitement. Butterflies we were very concerned with, and we specialized in collecting a rare variety of Chalk-Hill blue. It's called variety obsoleta. It's a kind of blue butterfly that has a variety which has a shortage of spots on the underside, and we collected rare forms of this, which involved collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of these butterflies and finding ones with this rare forms, and of course releasing the ones that didn't have this rare form. But so it became a kind of really specialist interest, and we're also interested in very many other natural historical things. But that involved really traveling all over the countryside in that area, which we got to know very well.
Which area is this?
This is the area of around 12 miles south of London, but we were on the fringe of open country, and so we were able to extend really over Surrey and part of Kent, cycling widely at that time. And in spite of it being wartime and there being enemy raids, my parents allowed this, and we were able to cycle around.
Were you a
widely.
boarder or a day?
I was a day, always a day school. I'm pleased to say I wouldn't have liked to have been a boarder. And so, so I really got to know the countryside, and that interest in the kind of outdoor world certainly played a part in my later anthropological career.
Because you later stress your interest in hunting and working with hunters and gatherers.
Yes, well, that really was a kind of spin-off from my interest in the countryside and my familiarity with the countryside. We weren't as children, we used to take a little tent and go and sleep out miles from anywhere, and we regarded this as a perfectly usual thing to do. And we would find some lake in a woodland area or something like that, and automatically would go swimming in it. We didn't think anything of that, and so we were entirely used to the notion of wandering around the countryside and exploring it, and it wasn't in any way intimidating to us. It was familiar, and we greatly enjoyed that as children.
What subjects at school particularly attracted you?
Well, I specialised in history, although I was also interested in languages. But for some reason, I don't know quite why, my parents were not keen that I should specialise at school in modern languages. Although I did languages, I learnt at school. I particularly French, but I also did at a low level. I did Spanish and Latin, but my parents weren't keen that I should specialise in modern languages for reasons that I really don't know quite what they were. But at any rate, so what I did was the subjects I specialised in were French, and then particularly history, and history interested me a great deal, and that was particularly important, but because there were some gifted teachers of history. And I do think all the time that in any form of education, what really matters is whether you have teachers who are gifted and who provide the right sort of stimulus. And certainly that was the case in history at school, and that was why when I came to apply for the university, I applied for courses in history.
Was there any particular teacher or teachers you remember, their names or having influenced you a lot?
Yes, I mean, there were two people who I remember particularly. One was called Mr. Hussey, I can't remember his first name, and the other was Bill Edge, who was a much younger man, and both of those were highly stimulating teachers, yes.
So you applied to read history at several universities or just Cambridge?
I think just Cambridge, as it happened. There was a family connection with Cambridge, and I can't remember applying to anywhere in addition to Cambridge. I think it was just Cambridge, and I got into Christ's College, yes, but then immediately had to do 2 years military service. In those days, it was obligatory. There was compulsory national service. So in 1952, in September 1952, I was called up and I went into the artillery, which my father had been in. I dabbled with being a conscientious objector at that time. I had some anxiety about the army, but in the end, I was conscripted, and that was that. I didn't persist with any idea of becoming a conscientious objector.
And where did you go? Where did you?
I was called up to Oswestry, which was an absolutely foul place. Or in my recollection it was. No doubt it's a splendid place now, or no doubt even then it was a splendid place, but my experience of it was not. I mean, I remember going there in this rather bleak September, and the army system then was really pretty brutal, and we were basically, it was a system of organized humiliation. I well remember one Sunday during my basic training hearing a broadcast at that time about how during some years earlier it had become illegal to punish people by running round the barrack square with a rifle held over their heads, in their two hands over their heads like this. I looked out of the window, and then, as every day, there were people being punished by running round the barrack square holding a rifle above their heads. And that really summed it up for me. Sorry, I'm talking too loud.
You were talking about the sadism of the army.
Yes, so it was an exercise in kind of organized humiliation. I remember too, in the training for firing 25-pounder guns for the artillery, one of the effects, you have to kneel, and one of the effects of kneeling is it destroys the polished fronts of your boots. And so what they did was they had us working for days beforehand to get the most incredible finish on our boots, and then they took us on gun drill, which destroyed it. And it was that was what summed the army up for me at that time an exercise in organized humiliation and really kind of breaking the spirit of recruits. And I thought that was just monstrous. And actually, one of the most useful things I think that my experience at Oswestry taught me, it gave me a lifelong hatred for all things military, which I think has been a very good lifelong lesson to have. I hate and despise the army, and I've no doubt that it's greatly changed now, but in those days it really was not an organization to be admired in any way. I don't think that it's acceptable to treat people in the way that they were treated. Anyway, what I did then was to seek a way, a means of escape. And my means of escape was to try to find some way of spending my 2 years productively away from the humiliations, as they then were, of ordinary military life. I managed to get on a course for military interpreters, and I was sent for for interview in London. Was interviewed in London, where I managed to convince people that I would be able to cope, and then went and started on an intensive course in Russian, where we were. The aim was, there were two levels, of course. One was for translators and the other was for interpreters. And after a struggle, I got onto the higher level, the interpreters course, and we were sent to Cambridge. And so right here in Cambridge, in the Station Road, we did 8 hours of Russian a day, very intensive pressure. And they had the most marvelous system of sanctions that later on, when I was a university teacher, I rather wished that this form of sanction had been available to me. Every Friday we had exams. Every Friday morning there were 3 exams. We did, first of all, there would be dictation. Read out in Russian, write down in Russian. That's okay. Then there would be written interpretership, English into Russian, read out in English, write down in Russian. That was okay. The third one was horrific. Read out in Russian and write down in English. Because if you, for some reason, lost what it was about, if it was all about lions, and you didn't grasp that it was all about lions, you could get very low marks. And whereas with the other two, it was very difficult to get very low marks in the dictation or working from English. But from Russian to English was really dangerous if you somehow or other lost track of it. Anyway, if you failed 2 weekly tests in a row, you put on your uniform and you went back to the army. And so lots of people actually failed 1 test, but almost nobody failed 2 tests. It was just, it just wasn't on. And we went through this course at a huge rate. I mean, we did our O levels in a few weeks, and then the A levels a few weeks later, and we really pushed on. And really quite quickly we were reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Lermontov in the original. And actually, the course was taught by a mixture of Cambridge University teachers of Russian and of military people, often Russians, often Russian people who either had come out at the time of the revolution, or quite a lot of Soviet dissenters who'd come out during the war. And so it was that mixture of people who taught us. And of course the university people were very keen to teach us the glories of Russian literature. And so we did some military Russian, but an awful lot of it, the majority of our time was actually spent doing Russian literature. And by the end of the time, I mean, we really had a good knowledge of Russian and quite an extensive knowledge of Russian literature by the end of the 2 years. I mean, we completed the course shortly before the end of the 2 years. It was never put to any use. What the army was trying to do was, this was at the height of the Cold War. I mean, Stalin actually died during the time when I was being taught Russian, much to the excitement, I may say, of the teachers on the course, many of whom celebrated the death of Stalin. You know, for many of the people, this was an absolutely epoch-making event. But anyway, we completed our training, and there we were, a substantial reserve, many hundreds of people who had this qualification in Russia, and if there had been conflict, we would have been used for all sorts of things, listening into to pilots talking, you know, translating materials, interviewing prisoners, and all of those kinds of jobs. We weren't being trained as spies or anything like that. We were being trained as people who would be needed if there had been any sort of conflict in the ordinary run-of-the-mill military jobs which involved knowledge of another language. There was very little advantage for regular military personnel to learn Russian. It wasn't. It wouldn't lead them to an effective career in the army, or that appeared to us to be the case. And so the army's solution to this was to take these compulsory recruits, people who were compelled to be in the army for 2 years, and to select from those hundreds of people who they gave this training to. And I mean, I've always valued this. It taught me particularly that really, you know, learning a language is not a tremendously big deal. You know, you just get on with it, and you can get down to it and learn it. And
yes, I was going to ask. You mentioned in another interview how learning a click language with the Hadzel was a major task you faced when you went to work with them.
yes.
And was this previous language experience helpful as a background to that difficult task?
Oh, it was certainly very useful, in the Russian particularly, but also the fact that I'd learned French at school and had a lower level knowledge of Spanish and Latin. It meant that, you know, that I understood the way that languages worked and was not inhibited by the idea of learning languages. In the field I had to learn 2 languages, but the language which really was difficult was Hadza, because it has a highly complex phonological system which wasn't understood at that time, with click consonants and other difficult phonological characteristics, which were really quite difficult to handle, but also a grammatically complex language, in which I had to spend a great deal of my time working out the grammar, which I did pretty systematically, and which, you know, the previous language experience with these European languages had given me a good background for taking that on.
Let's now perhaps move on to arriving to read a degree in, you'd been accepted presumably for history, and then you mentioned an interesting meeting you had. You wandered, I don't know how, you wandered accidentally into the archaeology and anthropology faculty, but you did, and who did you meet?
Yes, I mean, this was I was down to read, to come to read history here, and undoubtedly if I'd come straight at the age of 18 to university, I would have done a history degree. There's no question of that. That was what I was supposed to do. After 2 years in the army, I wondered whether to actually to take up Russian, but there seemed rather little point because, you know, we'd read a lot of the literature and our knowledge of the language was quite advanced, and it seemed rather a waste of the 3 years, which I would certainly have done new material, but a lot of it would have been going over ground that I'd already gone over, and I thought that was rather a pity. But the history had kind of receded into the background, and I was really looking looking at other possibilities as well at that time. And my grandfather had always been interested in archaeology in Ireland. I was much influenced by my grandfather. And I thought I would go, and I was looking around in Cambridge for other possibilities, and went into the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology. And there, just by chance, I met Meyer Fortes, who I didn't know. He was a complete stranger to me. And I don't recall exactly how we the first contact went, but I think I probably asked him who he was or something like that. At any rate, we went back to his room, and I explained that I was trying to decide what subject I should study in Cambridge. And I was completely entranced by talking to Meyer Fortes. Here he was, a full professor in Cambridge, who was willing to spend an hour of his time talking to somebody who had no knowledge of, who wasn't necessarily going to be a student in his department, but talking about his subject. And he was tremendously intrigued that I was interested in the possibilities of doing archaeology, or it was archaeology then that was the focus, because my grandfather had an interest in it, and he immediately launched into a discussion of the importance of grandfather-grandchild relationships. Absolutely fascinating, and I later came to know that that was a major focus of Meyer Fortes' interests. And he was also, I also talked a bit about, my the way that I valued my shared identity as being both English and Irish. And he again launched into a great discussion of the great advantages in anthropology of being a kind of part outsider, not just a mainstream kind of person, because it gave a particular perspective on life and on events that he felt was a very useful background for anthropology. Anyway, I thought that I was completely captivated by what Meyer said, and I immediately enrolled for archaeology and anthropology. Within a matter of a few weeks, it became clear to me that it wasn't the archaeology that interested me, it was the anthropology. Before I met Meyer and came to the first lectures in anthropology, I really had very little idea indeed of what anthropology was. But it was evident to me from within the first few weeks that I, by chance, had found the right subject. And there was never any doubt about it from that time. And it became a focus for my life and has remained so ever since.
And did Meyer continue to have a great influence on you later on?
Yes, I was much influenced by Meyer Fortes and enormously respected him, and got to know him quite well personally too. His wife was Russian, and I used to sometimes go and talk Russian to her.
Was this Doris or his previous wife?
No, this was his previous wife, Sonia, yes. Who died either while I was an undergraduate or while I was a postgraduate. I think whilst I was still an undergraduate. A very warm and pleasant person. Anyway, I didn't see her very often, but from time to time I went and talked to her, and it was always a pleasure to talk a little Russian. And yes, I liked Meyer enormously, and for me he was a kind of warm, paternal, basically authoritative figure, somebody who had a very kind of organized view of what anthropology was, and which I spent a lot of time trying to understand, and which seemed to me to make good sense, although to have its limitations. I found him, yes, I was really very greatly, I respected him and his anthropology greatly, and you know, really from the day of the first interview, I liked him a lot. Now, there were difficulties, of course. His books are very difficult to read, and particularly for a young undergraduate. And I can't say that his initial lectures were very impressive to a young undergraduate.
Didn't he?
He lectured on many subjects. He gave us introductory lectures, but he worked. They were kind of off the cuff, and often he seemed to pitch the level wrong, and I didn't feel that he was very good at that level. He was far better talking to postgraduates and to other academics. I thought that his talks to certainly to starting undergraduates were less effective. But I mean, it's very hard, I think, for any academic to be equally effective at talking at all the various levels they're expected to talk at, to people just starting the subject, to those who already know the subject well, and then to talking to their fellow academics. Meyer did find it difficult, I think, to straddle that whole range, and I thought he was better I found him immensely stimulating when at the postgraduate seminars that I attended, but certainly less so as at my the first lectures I attended that he gave.
The other person who actually became your tutor or your supervisor, I suppose, was Edmund Leach.
Yes.
How did you get on with Edmund?
Well, Edmund was a wonderfully charismatic figure, and I mean, he was so exciting to have as a teacher. There was nobody to compare with him as a teacher. I mean, he was just wonderful. I wrote an essay for him every week, went to have the weekly supervision. Very often it took well over the hour. He would write long comments on every essay, sometimes, I may say, as long as the essay itself. But you never knew in advance the way that he would react. I mean, if he didn't like the essay, he would cross it all out in red, and you know, he was sometimes, you know, you would get absolutely massive condemnation, red crossings out, and he would write in large red letters, "Rubbish," and at other times he would be very enthusiastic and would take off from some idea one had put forward and turn it into something marvelous, which it certainly hadn't been in the essay. And, you know, it was so stimulating, but also so disturbing, wondering which way it was going to go in that particular week. And later on, when I looked back at some of those essays, I don't know if I've still got them, I doubt if I have actually now, but when I look back at them, I realized just really that many of these assessments were really pretty arbitrary and were at any rate very exaggerated. But they were wonderfully stimulating as students, and tremendously, I mean, he was really wonderful at encouraging one to read widely on particular subjects and suggesting ways in which what one had written, how one could take off from there and go off in some new direction. Now, I found that tremendously stimulating, and no, he was a splendid teacher.
Were you aware as students of the tension between Meyer and Edmund?
The tension was at that stage as an undergraduate. He'd only just published his Political Systems of Highland Burma. That was published, I think, in 1954. Yeah. I started as a student it would have been in that year, in 54, and really I think that if there had been much tension at that time, I would have been aware of it, but I don't think there was much at that stage. It built up gradually over the years, and I think that the difficulties were really later difficulties. I think that was a very productive period for them both. I mean, it was really, you won't find, if you read Political Systems of Highland Burma, there isn't criticism of, as far as I recall, there's no criticism of the kind of approach that Meyer Fortis was advocating in that book. That all came later, and I think it was really rather a productive phase at that time in which they were each working to develop their own material, and it was only later when Leach began to question the applicability of Meyer's approach to his Asian material that the conflict really developed. So the answer to the question is, I wasn't aware as an undergraduate of much of significant conflict as far as I can recall, and I really don't think there was much conflict at that time. I think it was a later occurrence and built up over the years.
The other teachers were presumably Rio Fortune, and G.I. Jones was there by then? Or not?
Yes. G.I. Jones was there, and he supervised me at one time, very much the ethnographer, very much concerned with West Africa, his particular area of interest. A pleasant and conscientious and energetic teacher, but not the kind of person who you look to for stimulus in the theory of anthropology. He was above all somebody who emphasized the merits of ethnography and being serious about the collection of ethnography, and that was valuable. But he wasn't the person to whom one looked for great insights into the nature of anthropology. Rio Fortune was the eccentric, was there around the department. He was having at that stage great difficulty in attracting anybody to go to his lectures, which were completely wild and really not much contribution, I think, to anything. And very much, he was feeling extremely vitriolic in those days towards the memory of Malinowski, and used to spend much of the time in the lectures denouncing Malinowski and all of his works. It got a bit tiresome, actually, but Rio used to waylay undergraduates outside his lecture room, trying to get people to come in so that he could lecture to them. And it was a bad thing to be kind of anywhere near the entrance to the lecture room when Rio was giving his lecture at 11 in the morning. So we tended to take care to avoid being around at that particular time. It was difficult. I mean, I did go to some of his lectures, but really it wasn't very productive. What I did enjoy doing was going to lunch with Rio, and we used to go and have lunch in the then civic restaurant, the municipal restaurant, and we used to to enjoy conversations with Rio, making scurrilous remarks about all and sundry. And he was a nice, cheerful man, and very nice to talk to over lunch, but really not at that stage the person to talk to about, a person to listen to in lectures. Though we did read his book on Dobbu closely, and that's a very good book. And
Sorcerers of Dobbu. Yes.
Sorcerers of Dobbu, yes. I mean, that's an important book. Yeah. But really, he had. By 1954, he was already, I think, past the stage at which he was doing serious work in anthropology.
You were up with several contemporaries. You mentioned elsewhere Noah Yalman, the Harrises, Grace and Al Harris, and Frederick Barth. Is there anything to say about?
Yes, these weren't strictly speaking contemporaries. I mean, these were postgraduates while I was an undergraduate, and the system of teaching in Cambridge is one in which postgraduates do a lot of the teaching and do supervisions. I was supervised by all of these people, by Jean Lafontaine, by Grace and Al Harris, by Noah Yalman, and by Frederick Bath. And I found that enormously stimulating. All fresh back from the field, all bursting with new ideas and new material. And I found that tremendously stimulating. And I well remember those encounters. They were a great source of encouragement. And I think the system in which postgraduates are heavily involved in teaching doesn't always work awfully well, but certainly in those cases, I thought it was tremendously valuable. Certainly in my Cambridge education, all of those people had a great effect on me. As in those days, there were really rather few undergraduates in Cambridge, and there wasn't the degree of separation between undergraduates and postgraduates that later developed. I mean, we used to meet socially, and as undergraduates, we were able to, those of us who were determined and enthusiastic, were often able to infiltrate into seminars and lectures which were really intended for postgraduates. And so long as there weren't too many of us, nobody really cared. In fact, people probably were rather pleased. But there wasn't the separation that later developed was very much a product of numbers, and also of the kind of greater institutionalization of universities that developed in the 1960s.
You used to go off to the bun shop.
Yes, we used to, and to the mill and to other places, and yes, and talk. And so it was a kind of the atmosphere was one in which really we were able to talk to, as undergraduates, to talk to anybody, and there was far less formality and separation than later developed.
So did you decide while you were an undergraduate that you wanted to go on and do a PhD?
Yes, I mean, particularly in my second year, it became clear to me that if an opportunity developed, and in those days there were extremely few posts in anthropology and extremely few, it's very difficult indeed to get research grants. People often complained later on about how it become much more difficult to get research grants. I don't believe that was the case at all. I believe it was far more difficult in the 1950s to get funding for research than it was later. There were, academic posts at the time when I was trying to get an academic post in the early 1960s were really extremely few and very difficult indeed to obtain, and an awful lot depended on luck, and I was lucky. Now, yes, by my second year, I had already become interested in the possibility of doing a PhD and maybe going on after a PhD in anthropology, and started searching around for places to work. And I wanted to work somewhere exotic and isolated and miles from anywhere, that would kind of bring together my interest that I developed in childhood in the countryside and my interest in wild nature with my interest that I developed in anthropology in what might be described as isolated peoples, of peoples with a close identification with the wilderness. And that led me to focus on hunter-gatherers. But not just on hunter-gatherers. In my third and final year, I started applying for field research grants. And I had three. I applied to work in three quite separate areas. I applied to work, first of all, with a group that later became known as the Yanomamo. In those days, they had a rather different name. And there was rather little written. There were some missionary accounts, but really not much material, but enough to see that they were a fascinating group. I applied to a number of grant-giving bodies to work there, and those applications failed. I didn't get anywhere with them. I also applied to work in New Guinea, and the Australian National University was advertising research grants to work in New Guinea, and I applied to work with a group that in those days were called the Kuku Kuku, and who subsequently became known as the Baruya. And I actually received funding from the Australian National University to work with the Baruya, and I was very tempted to take this up. The funding was generous. John Barnes was then in the department, was then, I think, head of department at the ANU, and it was a very attractive place to work. I knew John Barnes' work and greatly admired it, and so I was very attracted by that possibility. But in the end, I accepted the third project, and this was I had become very interested in African hunter-gatherers. Now, the data at that time on African hunter-gatherers was really very inadequate. The data on the pygmies was dominated by a completely outdated paradigm developed in Germany by Schebester and others, and Father Schmidt, and really completely outdated and unsatisfactory. The work on the Bushmen really hadn't moved on much from the splendid compilation by Isaac Shapira in the Khoisan peoples of South Africa, although new work had started by Lorna Marshall. At that time, scarcely any of it had been published. It was just beginning to be published. And really very little was known about the Bushmen at that stage. There had been a student from Cambridge who'd attempted to work among the Bushmen, but who had been but who had such ecological difficulties in doing the work that his work had been a failure, and I was discouraged from working among the Bushmen by that story. I can't remember what the name of the person was, but it was held up as a cautionary tale at that time. This was long before Richard Lee went to the Kalahari. I became interested in East African savanna hunters, among whom there had been no modern work. And the group that was of particular interest were people who at that time were called by three names. They were called the Hadzapi, they were called the Kangeju, and they were called the Kindiga. There had been two brief but fairly recent articles on them, one written by a game man called Cooper, and an article on material culture written by a colonial administrator called Henry Fosbrook, who had been an administrator in an area close to the Hadza and subsequently became government anthropologist in Tanganyika, as it then was. And I met him. He came on a visit to Cambridge would have been 1956, I think. I met him on a visit to Cambridge, and he was able to assure me that the Hadza had not been sedentarized, that they were still living a fully nomadic way of life. He was very skeptical about whether it would be possible to live with them. He said that what I should do was to base myself in the nearest government center and to send out people to bring in Hadza and interview them in the government center. An idea that I completely rejected out of hand. It seemed to me to be an appalling way of approaching field research. But the key thing that he told me was that the people were there and living a nomadic way of life, and that they hadn't been, they hadn't, like so many other groups already had by that time, forcibly sedentarized. Anyway, I applied to a number of different bodies and got a number of grants, £100 here, £100 there, small amounts of money, and eventually was able to put these together and get enough to do field research among them. And this was very much my own project, much more than the Baruja one would have been. That was very much the ANU's project for which they were recruiting people. The Hudson project was my own project. It was nobody else's. And that was what I did, and I never regretted that.
You were supervised by Meyer, were you?
No, I wasn't actually.
Or
I was.
Aidan Southall?
Well, it was complicated because, yes, in East Africa, while I was out there, I was the head of the East African Institute of Social Research at Makerere University in Uganda, which was then the only university in East Africa. So I went from Makerere to work in Tanganyika, many hundreds of miles away. But yes, so basically, yes, Aidan Southall had responsibility for me while I was out there, and I used to go back to the Institute of Social Research every 6 months for conferences, which really didn't have anything much to do with hunter-gatherers, but which were very academically stimulating, and which I always greatly enjoyed. And I used to talk to Aidan and others at the Institute a great deal about my work, and although it all seemed very strange to them, I mean, what became apparent really from quite early days during my research is that African hunter-gatherers were really neither like African peasant farmers or pastoralists. They didn't have elaborated lineage systems or other kinship systems of that sort. They had no clans or lineages or the kind of binding ties between generations which are characteristics of those systems in Africa, but nor did they have systems like Australian ones. I mean, Meyer seemed to think that in Africa I might, if I was really lucky, encounter systems that were a bit like Australia, you know, really wonderfully elaborated kinship and ritual systems, which were a kind of echo of the Australian systems. Or I might find some system which was which had some real definable relation to the kind of system that he had analyzed among African peasant farmers. Now, in fact, what I found was something quite different from either of those, a system of very flexible social relationships, which really didn't look at all like what was going on in other well-described African societies, but also didn't really look like Australia either.
How extensive was your fieldwork training for this exercise? I think in those days, from other accounts I've heard, it was not exactly the format that the Economic and Social Research Council nowadays would think was approvable.
It wasn't just not the format, it was non-existent. There wasn't any training. I mean, it was extraordinary, and I think disgraceful. I mean, I think it was really thoroughly reprehensible. The view was, well, you've done an undergraduate degree, and off you went to the field, and studied some group, and then came back and wrote a PhD about them. Now, this was just crazy. I mean, I must say that when I arrived in the field, I had extremely little idea of what I was supposed to be doing. I had very little idea of what techniques I might apply to obtain information. I also had very although I'd read widely on hunter-gatherers, I hadn't kind of put it all together. I hadn't thought now, I hadn't had to write a research proposal, so I hadn't really developed a set of ideas about what I might look for or what I should be looking for. And so both at the level of developing hypotheses and at the level of practicalities of fieldwork, how you actually set about it, what you do. Well, I mean, it was a situation of gross ignorance and really very unsatisfactory. Now, going to the East African Institute of Social Research in Macfarlane was a great help. It really was. So I took my first degree in June. By November, I was at the Institute. And there were a whole lot of other people doing field research who came in for conferences, and one learned enormously from what they were doing. Their papers were very much focused on what they were actually doing. But also Aidan Suddle took us on, took me and another newly arrived researcher also from Cambridge called Gehan Wijewardena, who was working on the Kenyan coast, and also the coast of Tanganyika, took us to do a piece of basically ethnographic survey work in Uganda for a week or two. And that was a real eye-opener. In that case, we worked very much through the administrative structure. Went and talked to the local chief, who found us people to talk to. But I mean, in the course of a few days, we were able to learn a huge amount about an ethnically very diverse area, a very mixed area, which was all kind of surface stuff, but was extremely rich and detailed. And I was amazed at the amount of data that was accessible in that way. Now, of course, it was impossible to judge the material adequately in a few days, and impossible to deal with topics that were in any way sensitive. But it was still a very valuable exercise.